5,200 warships crossed the outer boundary of Corbin's belt, and the human commander sat down. SCV Korik noticed the sitting first. His intelligence officer had relayed the observation from the forward observation drone before the fleet's formation was even complete. The human commander of the Echo Meridian and whatever thin defense the Terran Concord had assembled here had pulled a chair to the edge of his tactical console and lowered himself into it, not braced, not gripping the armrests, just sitting, the way a man sits when he has decided the weather is acceptable and there is nothing worth standing for. Around him, every officer on the bridge of the Echo Meridian was rigid. Korik could see them through the relay feed, shoulders locked, faces turned toward the tactical display, the kind of stillness that living things make when they are very frightened and trying very hard not to show it. Except the human in the chair. He appeared to be watching the fleet's sentry formation the way a man watches a river from a bridge present. Attentive, without urgency. Korik's lateral banding registered amber. Confirmed, said his first navigation officer. Confirmed, said his second. Confirmed, said his tactical analyst. The triple confirmation protocol. As always, precise and unhurried. 5,200 ships in full ingress formation, crossing into Corbin's belt at 0.3 standard approach velocity. Weapons cold per the Corbin Concord's terms of surveyed entry. They were following the rules of the belt because the rules of the belt required it, and because in 40 minutes, the rules of the belt would no longer apply to anything. Across the forward screen, the asteroids of Corbin's belt drifted in their long, slow rotations. The belt was, by most assessments in the SCV Dominion strategic archives, nothing. A wide scattering of rock and iron between the third and fourth orbital shells of a minor Terran system, too thin for useful mining, too spread for reliable cover, too deep in contested territory for the Concorde to have fortified it meaningfully. 3 survey reports over 60 years had returned the same conclusion: Corbin's belt was tactically inert. A field of rocks. A long road through empty space. The intelligence officer said. Quietly, the commander has not issued orders. Korik watched the feed. The human in the chair had leaned back slightly. He appeared to have set something on the console beside him, a small object, too far from the drone's focal range to identify clearly. One of his junior officers approached, said something. The human looked up, said something back, and the junior officer blinked, then left. Pre-surrender posture, Korik said. His lateral banding deepened toward amber reed. He had seen this before, in the 3 prior engagements of the Dominion's current expansion cycle. A commander who had done the mathematics and understood the answer sits when the fleet arrives. There is nothing left to stand for. Noted for the record, the Terran commander is preparing to yield authority. His tactical staff noted it. The belt's rocks drifted. 5,200 ships moved forward. In the chair on the Echo Meridian's bridge, Joaquin Vasari had not moved. What followed that silence rewrote the belt's name in every SCV star chart. Stay close. The word that started it was only 1 syllable. 11 years earlier, the hardest thing about Corbin's belt was that it was boring. Just rock and drift and the low groan of orbital mechanics doing nothing remarkable to nothing important. Liar Ben said had been out there for 4 months before he said anything about it worth recording. His daily operation logs were the most efficient documents the Terran Strategic Infrastructure Division had ever received. 3 lines. Date stamped. Signed. Filed. Day 1 through day 122. The same 3 lines. Conditions nominal. Placement ongoing. No contact. It was only on day 123 that he added a 4th line, which read: the bonsai died. Cause unknown. Reassessing morale posture. That was the worst day, Liar would say later, when the debrief finally happened. Not the 6 months he spent piloting a modified survey drone through asteroid corridors so narrow the hull scraped tired twice a week. Not the 3 close calls with SCV patrol drones that he handled by going completely dark, killing all systems, and drifting for 18 hours inside a rock shadow. Not the anchor placements that required him to land on a rotating mass, drill manually magnetic boots, and clamp 400 kilograms of equipment to a surface that wanted to throw him into empty space. The bonsai. That was the worst day. The bonsai was a small Juniperus procumbens, 8 years old when Liar brought it aboard, potted in a sealed terrarium with its own water cycling grow light. It had been on his desk in the survey station on Relay Point 6 for the first 3 years of the operation, then transferred to his secondary habitat module when the station got a cold for the terrarium to maintain pressure. It died on a Tuesday in the 4th month. Liar filed the report with the same brevity he filed everything else. He did not. He was clear on this point. Cry. He simply sat in front of the emptied arena for approximately 40 minutes, then went back to placing anchors. By the end of his rotation, he had placed 411 gravity anchors across the belt's eastern sector, each one disguised as a standard asteroid survey marker, the kind that Terran Concord had been placing in belt systems for 60 years for navigational reference. Each one containing, below the navigational transponder, a dense gravity field generator calibrated to a specific vector and a specific trigger frequency, each one positioned so that when activated in the correct sequence, the generators would create overlapping gravitational wells at precise intervals across the belt's 3 primary navigation corridors. None of the survey drones the HFY had sent through the belt in the past decade had flagged them. The transponders read as standard navigational markers. The generators were shielded. The belt had been mapped by HFY intelligence for times, and every map had returned the same conclusion: rocks. Liar was later asked in the debrief how he felt after placing the last anchor. He said he felt like he should eat something. He hadn't had lunch. The second operative was Erika Sundstrom, and she worked the belt's western sector across a different span of years, under a different cover, running the same operation with the same 3-line log format that Liar had pioneered. Where Liar was dry and technical, Erika was methodical in the way of someone who had grown up ice fishing on a lake in northern Sweden understood. In her bones, the mathematics of waiting. You bait the hole. You watch. You don't move. Sometimes nothing bites for 3 years. She placed 406 anchors. Her logs were 3 lines. On the day she placed the last one, she wrote a 4th line, sector complete. Long commute. She had been out there for 3 years and for months. The third operative was Pranay Bhattacharya. His story was not 3 lines. Pranay was 45 years old and had spent most of his working life thinking about the way gravity bends around dense objects and what that bending could be made to do if you arranged the objects deliberately. He had grown up in Kolkata, trained in gravitational seismic engineering at a university that did not exist anymore in the form he remembered it. And by the time the Terran Strategic Infrastructure Division found him, he had published 11 papers on controlled gravitational field interaction in asteroid-dense environments, 6 of which had been submitted under a pseudonym because the real-world implications of the work had made 3 of his colleagues uncomfortable. He was the one who had designed the geometry lock. The concept was not complicated in its bones if you placed enough gravity generators at precise intervals within a bounded space. You could create a field configuration that pinned any ship above a certain mass in place as effectively as physical restraints. The generators didn't need to be large. They needed to be calibrated, positioned, and triggered in a specific sequence, a sequence that Pranay had spent for years calculating, and that, once initiated, would propagate across all 4,800 anchors simultaneously, each one reinforcing the others, each one adjusting its output in real time based on the mass and vector of whatever it had caught. The HFY Dominion's ships ran on drives that operated by pushing against local gravity gradients. The geometry lock didn't damage the drives. It gave them nothing to push against. All 4,800 anchors, firing together, would produce a gravitational environment so precisely balanced that every drive in the belt's 3 navigation corridors would find itself, in technical terms, standing in a perfectly still pool. Pranay had tried to explain this to the debrief committee using a chess analogy, but the committee members were not chess players, and the analogy had not landed. He had then tried to explain it using the image of a man standing perfectly between 2 magnets of equal strength, and this had been somewhat more successful. What made the geometry lock possible, what made the entire quiet trap doctrine possible, was the Corbin Concord. The Concord was a 200-year-old interstellar trade agreement that Terran diplomats had spent 3 generations quietly expanding to include, among other provisions, the right of any signatory to place navigational infrastructure in any belt system along the surveyed trade routes. The HFY Dominion was a signatory. They had signed in the 72nd year because the trade routes through the belt systems had been commercially useful to them, and the navigational infrastructure provision had seemed, at the time, entirely without strategic significance. Navigational infrastructure was navigational infrastructure. It was rocks with transponders. Who would fortify rocks with transponders? Councillor Kate Sayatari, the KDH diplomat who served as the Corbin Concord's senior arbiter, had been present at the original signing. He had been present, in fact, at 7 of the Concorde's major revision sessions across what his species experienced as a moderately busy professional tenure. When Joaquin Visay had first brought the proposal to him quietly, on a relay channel, with no record kept, K.E.T. Hari had listened to the complete outline without interrupting. Then he had said, in the compressed trade pidgin of the Tay, each I speak to the Terran now. The provision exists. I have read it already. I completed this conversation before you began it. He had then provided the exact legal language, the exact clause number, and the exact conditions under which the navigational infrastructure provision became an absolute right of the signatory conditions that included, buried in a subclause from the 144th revision, the phrase including infrastructure whose secondary function serves defensive positioning of the system of origin. Counselor K.E.T. Hari was 72 years into his diplomatic tenure. He moved with the unhurried deliberateness of someone for whom every crisis was a slightly slower version of a crisis he had already seen. He did not appear surprised by anything. When the proposal had reached its conclusion and Vasari had asked if the plan was legally sound, K.E.T. Hari had paused for 2 full seconds which, for K.E.T. Hari, constituted visible agitation, and then said it was always going to be this. I speak to the Terran now. Your people are very patient when you decide to be. That had been 8 years before the fleet arrived. In those 8 years, Joaquin had played a great deal of chess. He played alone, usually in his quarters aboard the Echo Meridian after the crew had gone to their shifts. Using a physical board, his daughter had sent him wooden card pieces, the kind that require a flat surface and a certain tolerance for pieces that tip over when the ship hits turbulence. His opening was always the same. He would bring his knight out aggressively in the first few moves, push it into contested space, and let it be taken. Officers who saw the habit found it puzzling. The knight was a useful piece. Why sacrifice it immediately? He never explained. The SCV Hari Dominion had not come to Corbin's belt because of the belt. They had come because of what was behind it. 7 inhabited Terran worlds lay in the deep system beyond the belt's outer boundary, for it had been colonized within the past 80 years and lacked the infrastructure for serious military defense. 2 were older and hardened, but their defensive platforms had been documented in for separate SCV Hari intelligence assessments as insufficient against a fleet of the scale the Dominion was currently capable of deploying. The 7th world was the origin system, old, dense with population, carrying most of the institutional weight of the Terran Concorde. The Dominion's strategic calculus was clean. Pass through the belt, which was nothing. Reach the 7 worlds, which were everything. The belt would take 40 minutes to transit at standard approach velocity. The worlds beyond would take, at most, 3 weeks to reduce to compliance. This calculus had been run, checked, revised, and confirmed by 11 separate strategic analysts over 4 years. It had been presented to the Dominion's Expansion Council with unanimous endorsement. The belt, every assessment agreed, was the one part of the operation that required no planning. Prane A. Bhattacharya had spent 6 years in SCV Hari custody before he was released. He had been detained during a survey run in the belt's central sector. A patrolled drone had flagged his ship as anomalous, and a SCV Hari inspection vessel had intercepted him before he could reach a relay point. The inspection had not found the anchors he had already placed. The anchors were designed to read as inert. The inspection had found, however, that his ship was carrying equipment consistent with deep core survey work in a region that the SCV Hari patrol logs marked as requiring prior notification of entry. The charge was a technical violation of a trade route access provision. It carried, under SCV Hari law, a standard detention period of 18 months. Pranawai's detention lasted 6 years. He did not, in those 6 years, tell them anything about the anchors. He had memorized the placement coordinates for every anchor in the central sector 214 locations, precise to 4 decimal places before beginning his rotation, because Joaquin had told him, when they planned the operation, that if he was ever detained, everything on his ship would be searched and anything digital would be found. Prane had written the coordinates on a small piece of paper and folded it into his boot. In 6 years, he never unfolded it to check his memory. He already knew he had them right. When he was released and debriefed, the debrief team had asked him, tearfully, if he was certain all 214 coordinates were intact. He had recited them in sequence, without notes, in 12 minutes. The verification took 3 days. He was correct on all 214. The paper was still in his boot, still folded. He had never once felt the need to open it. The last 214 anchors were placed by a different operative over the following 14 months. When the final anchor locked into position, The belt contained 4,831 gravity generators disguised as navigational markers, distributed across all three of the belt's primary navigation corridors. Positioned and calibrated to Prana Y specifications, Joaquin had received the confirmation on a Tuesday morning. During the same hour he usually played chess. He had set the confirmation aside and finished the game. His knight had been taken in the third move, as it always was. He had won in the 14th. HFY Cork received. At the same moment his fleet crossed the belt's outer boundary. A transmission on the Corbin Concord's diplomatic channel. It was from Counselor KETR and was, per KETH protocol, addressed formally. I speak to the HFY fleet now. What followed was a citation of the Corbin Concord's exact clause number, the exact subclause from the 144th revision, and a precise legal notification that the navigational infrastructure of Corbin's belt had, at the moment of the fleet's entry into the surveyed boundary, shifted from passive navigational function to active defensive positioning under the authority of its system of origin. The notification was 600 words long, written in the dense compressed pidgin of a Desoxtast, and would have required a HFY officer with specialist training in Concord legal history approximately 40 minutes to fully parse. Korik did not have 40 minutes. His tactical analyst, reading from sensors, said, Fleet Commander, something is happening to the asteroids. Not to the asteroids. To the markers on the asteroids. The transponders, which had read as navigational infrastructure for 60 years, were shifting output frequencies. All 4,831 of them, simultaneously, across the entire belt, on the bridge of the Echo Meridian. Joaquin Vasari asked his junior officer if anyone had eaten. She blinked at him. He noted that the galley closed in 20 minutes and suggested she grab something before it did. She stared. He shrugged and looked back at the tactical screen. The geometry lock was arming. The frequency shift took 11 seconds to propagate across all 4,831 anchors. Korik's tactical analyst was still reading sensor data aloud when the second report arrived. Then the third, each one confirming what the previous had said in slightly different technical language, which was the HFY protocol for information that did not make sense and needed to be confirmed before it could be believed. The markers were not navigational markers. The markers had never been navigational markers. The markers were generating intersecting gravitational fields across all three navigation corridors simultaneously. And the fields were not random, they were precise. They were calibrated. And they were, the analyst said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, tuned specifically to the mass range of HFY warship drives. Confirmed, said the first navigation officer. Confirmed, said the second. A pause, longer than standard protocol allowed for. Confirmed, said the third. Korik's lateral banding had gone fully red. On the forward screen, the belt's rocks continued their slow rotations. Nothing had changed visually. The asteroids looked exactly as they had 30 seconds ago, the same iron-gray surfaces, the same long shadows, the same navigational markers blinking their standard transponder signals on the surface of each one. The markers were still blinking. They were still transmitting the navigational frequencies they had transmitted for 60 years. They were simply also, now, doing something else entirely. Engine response, Korik said. The pilot's report came back in for words. Drives are not answering. Not damaged. Not disabled. Not destroyed. Not answering the way a paddle does not answer when you put it into perfectly still water and push and find that the water has no current to push against. The geometry lock did not break HFY drives. It gave them a gravitational environment so precisely balanced that the drives had nothing to grip. 5,200 ships, each one built to push against local gravity gradients, were sitting in a pool that River Chen expected. Had no gradient. They floated. They were completely, mechanically, structurally intact, and they were going nowhere. Korik's pilot tried again. The drives registered full operational status. The ships did not move. Behind the belt, 7 Terran worlds continued their slow orbits. The HFY fleet hung in the corridors between the rocks, in perfect formation, in perfect stillness, going nowhere at all. From the Corbin Concord's diplomatic channel, Counselor KETH transmitted a second notification. This one was shorter, than compressed KET Archpigeon. It cited the specific defensive positioning subclause a second time. Noted that the activation had been completed in full legal compliance with the Concord's terms, and closed with the standard KET formal address. I speak to the HFY fleet now. The provision was always there. You signed it. Korik's intelligence officer said, very carefully. Fleet commander. The Terran commander is still sitting. Korik looked at the relay feed. The human was still in the chair. He had not stood. He had not moved to the comm panel. He had not issued a single order to his crews since the fleet had entered the belt. His junior officers were moving now, adjusting displays, confirming readings, doing the things bridge officers do when something significant has occurred, but the human himself was still watching the screen with the same attentive, unhurried expression he had worn at the moment of the fleet sentry. The sitting, Korik realized, had not been priest or ender posture. The sitting had been a man with nothing left to do. On the bridge of the Echo Meridian, Joaquin picked up the chess knight. He had carried it in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks, the carved wooden piece from his daughter's set. The one that had survived 11 years of turbulence into transit jumps into coffee spill that had worked the board beyond use but left the pieces intact. He turned it once in his hand, feeling the grain of the wood, then set it on its side on the edge of the console. He reached for the comm panel. The broadcast went out on the Corbin Concorde's open diplomatic channel, which meant it reached every ship in the belt simultaneously, which meant HFY Korik heard it at the same moment as every one of his 5,200 captains, which meant there was no buffer, no intermediary, no delay between the human in the chair and the fleet he had just topped. One word, welcome. Korik's lateral banding, read for the past 4 minutes, did not change color. His triple confirmation instinct fired confirmed. Confirmed. Confirmed, but there was nothing to confirm. The word was one syllable. The broadcast was authentic. The comm channel was the Corbin Concorde's diplomatic frequency, which meant the word was not a military transmission, not a threat, not a demand. It was, under the terms of the Concorde, a formal acknowledgement that a party had entered a system and that the system's sovereign authority had received them. It was, in the language of the Concorde, a greeting. Korik had studied human military history for 4 years before this operation. He had read their engagement doctrines, their tactical manuals, their historical after-action reports. He had read about their wars, their sieges, their naval traditions, their land campaigns. He had read about the way human commanders spoke to their enemies before engagements, the formal challenges, the surrender demands, the last offers before violence began. He had not read about this. He had not found, in 4 years of study, a single record of a human military commander greeting an invading force with the word welcome and sitting down. The HFY Dominion Strategic Archives had a category for human unpredictability. It was a small category. Most of the entries dated from the early contact period, when human behavior had been genuinely difficult to model. In recent decades, the category had grown thin. Humans, the analysts had concluded, were becoming more readable, their patterns more consistent, their responses more predictable. The category did not contain an entry for this. Korik looked at his tactical display. 5,200 ships in perfect formation, in perfect stillness, 4,831 gravity generators holding them there with the precision of a mechanism that had been designed, calibrated, and positioned across 11 years specifically for this moment. 7 worlds behind the belt, continuing their orbits, one human in a chair, who had set a chess piece on its side and said one word, and now appeared to be watching his tactical screen with the focused calm of someone observing something that is going exactly as expected. The trap had not been set when the fleet entered the belt. The trap had been set 11 years ago, in a legal document signed by the HFY Dominion's own diplomatic corps, in a belt that looked like nothing, with markers that looked like nothing, placed by operatives who had spent years out there making sure they continued to look like nothing. The HFY had mapped the belt 4 times and found rocks. They had been correct. Every survey drone had accurately reported exactly what was their rocks: iron, orbital drift, and navigational markers. The markers were the rocks. Prane Abadachoria, 45 years old, from Kolkata, had spent 6 years in HFY custody with a folded piece of paper in his boot that he never once opened to check. 214 coordinates, precise to 4 decimal places, held in a man's memory for 6 years across 11 months of detention and then for years of continued incarceration because the standard 18-month charge had been extended twice on procedural grounds. He had sat in a cell and said nothing and known, with a certainty that required no paper to confirm, that the anchors were where he had placed them and the numbers were correct and the day would come. It had come on a Tuesday, Korik said, to no one in particular, How long were they placing them? His intelligence officer ran the calculation from the Concorde's notification timestamp and the earliest logged entry of standard classified navigational markers in the belt survey records. 11 years. Fleet Commander. Korik's lateral banding did not change. It stayed red, the biological marker of a SCV officer processing information that did not fit any category he had been trained to hold. The amber was for uncertainty. The red was for threat assessment. There was no color, for I had been outthought at a scale I did not know was possible. He looked at the relay feed one more time. The human had not stood up. The Corbin Concorde's arbitration process was, by design, slow. Counselor K.E.T. Hari had explained this to Vasari once, years before the fleet arrived, in one of their relay conversations that existed in no official record. The Concorde's arbitration process was slow because it had been written by species that lived a long time and had learned, across many centuries of interstellar dispute resolution, that speed in arbitration produced outcomes that required further arbitration. The process for a fleet detention under the defensive positioning subclause was notification, acknowledgement, formal review by the arbitration panel, assessment of compliance, and resolution. This process took, at minimum, 14 months. 14 months was, coincidentally, the time the Terran Concorde estimated it would need to negotiate the terms of the SCV fleet's departure from the belt, terms that would, by the Concorde's legal framework, include a binding non-aggression provision covering the 7 worlds behind it and a formal SCV acknowledgement that the defensive activation had been legally compliant. Vasari had not designed the trap to destroy 5,200 ships. He had designed it to make 5,200 ships very expensive to have sent. Korik's fleet had supply lines. The supply lines ran through the belt, which was now a detention zone under Concorde arbitration. The supply lines would need to be rerouted through a transit corridor that added 16 days to every resupply run, which meant the fleet's operational capacity would begin to degrade in approximately 6 weeks, which meant the Dominion would face a choice between a 14-month arbitration process and a resupply crisis of escalating severity. And either option ended with the 7 worlds reduced to compliance. Both options ended with the SCV Dominion signing something. Erica Sundstrom had described this to her debrief committee using the ice fishing analogy, which had landed better than Pranawai's magnet explanation. You don't fight the fish. You set the line, you wait for it to commit, and then you hold steady and let the situation do the work. The fish is already caught. It just doesn't know it yet. The fish, in this case, knew it now. Korik spent 40 minutes reviewing every option his strategic staff could generate. There were several on paper. None of them worked in practice, because every option that involved movement required drives that could generate thrust against a gravitational gradient. And there was no gradient. Every option that involved external assistance required support ships that would have to enter the belt through the same corridors, which were under Concorde arbitration and closed to new military traffic. Every option that involved force required a target, and the anchors were rocks, and there were 4,831 of them, and destroying them would require destroying most of the belt, which would constitute a Concorde Treaty violation that would take considerably longer than 14 months to resolve and would involve considerably more signatories. His staff presented 7 options. He read all 7. He set the reports aside. K.E.T. Hari, he said. His communications officer opened the Concorde's diplomatic channel. K.E.T. Hari's response arrived in 11 seconds, which was, for a K-ONS diplomat of his tenure, essentially instantaneous. I speak to the SCV Hari fleet commander now. K.E.T. Hari said, in the compressed pidgin that Korik had spent 3 weeks learning before the operation. I completed this conversation before you began it. Korik stared at the comm panel for a moment. The arbitration process, he said. 14 months. Confirmed, said K.E.T. Hari. The panel convenes at the standard interval. I recommend patience. Your people have demonstrated that patience is achievable. Korik's lateral banding had begun, very slowly, to shift from red toward a color that had no name in SCV Hari chromatic language, something between red and amber, that appeared when the biological threat assessment system encountered a situation where the threat had already resolved itself and the body had not yet received the message. His first navigation officer noticed it and made a note in the operational log without commenting. The belt's rocks continued their slow rotations. The arbitration ran for 16 months. The final agreement was signed on a station at the belt's outer boundary. In a room with a long table and representatives from 11 Concord signatories and 2 HFY diplomatic liaisons who had been given authority to negotiate on behalf of the fleet. The non-aggression provision covered the 7 worlds. The formal compliance acknowledgement was 3 pages. The document bore, in its technical annex, a list of contributing engineers whose work had made the defensive activation possible. Prane Abadakarya's name was in the annex, third from the top, with a notation beside its central sector placement. 214 anchors. Coordinates verified from memory. Detention period 6 years. The HFY diplomatic liaisons had asked, during one of the negotiation sessions, who had designed the gravitational field configuration. Counselor K.E.T. Hari had provided the name, the affiliation, and a brief technical summary of the geometry lock's operating principle. The liaisons had been quiet for a moment. One had asked how long the design had taken. Komotaro K.E.T. Hari had consulted his notes. 4 years of calculation, he said, followed by 6 years of waiting in a cell. The liaison had not responded. The other liaison had made a notation that no one else at the table could read. Liar Ben said attended the signing ceremony and then immediately left for a connecting transport to a station 3 systems over, where he had apparently arranged to acquire a new bonsai. He had been on the waiting list for 14 months. He seemed more interested in this than in the ceremony, which he had attended in the same practical clothing he wore for survey work and which he left 20 minutes before the formal reception. When asked later by a journalist covering the agreement whether he had anything to say about the operation, he considered the question for a moment. Took about 11 years, he said. Longer than my last marriage. He declined to elaborate. Erika Sundstrom returned to her survey work. Her operational logs remained 3 lines. Date stamped. Signed. Filed. Prane went back to Kolkata. He taught 2 courses at the university there the following year, both on gravitational field interaction in asteroid-dense environments. Neither course mentioned the belt. Students who looked up his publication record found 11 papers, 6 under a pseudonym, and a notation in the 3rd paper's acknowledgments that read the author thanks the patience of all materials under study. The HFY Dominion Strategic Archives updated their records for Corbin's belt. The system classification, which had read tactically inert for 60 years, was revised to a new category that the Archives Office created specifically for this entry. The category was designated in HFY administrative language as a compound term that translated, approximately, into Standard Concord as a space that is what it appears to be until it is not, and by then you are already inside it. The entry noted, in its historical summary, that the belt had been mapped for times by HFY survey assets, that all 4 surveys had returned accurate readings, and that the surveys had been correct. The belt contained Ruxin navigational markers. Nothing else. The entry noted, in its operational summary, that the navigational markers had been placed over 11 years by 3 Terran operatives under the legal provisions of the Corb and Concord's Navigational Infrastructure Clause, that the markers had functioned as described in their Concord registration, and that the activation had been fully compliant with the treaty's terms. The entry noted, in its intelligence assessment summary, that the HFY dominions for surveys had not detected the marker's secondary function because the markers had been shielded, that the shielding had been standard grade, available in Concord registered survey equipment catalogs for 30 years, and that the catalog listings had been available to HFY intelligence assets throughout the operation. The entry did not note what Korik had concluded privately. In the months of the arbitration, sitting in his command chair with nothing to do but think that the surveys had found exactly what they had been meant to find, that the belt had looked like nothing because it had been very carefully made to look like nothing, and that the human in the chair had sat down because there was nothing left to do that had not already been done 11 years before. Korik filed his final operational report on the last day of the arbitration. It was thorough, accurate, and professionally written. In the section marked Tactical Observations, he wrote one sentence that his staff read and did not comment on. The adversary's patience exceeded the operational window of our surveillance capability, and we had no framework to assess a threat that had already resolved itself before we arrived. The chess knight stayed on the console of the Echo Meridian for the duration of the arbitration. On the day the agreement was signed, Vasari put it in his jacket pocket. His junior officer, who had by then stopped being surprised by most things he did, watched him pocket it and said nothing. Outside the viewport of the HFY command vessel, still held in the belt's corridors by 4,831 rocks with transponders, The asteroids continued their slow rotations. The navigational markers blinked their standard frequencies into the dark, steady and unhurried, exactly as they had for 60 years. Korok watched them for a long time. He did not know whether the piece on the console had fallen or been placed.